The basic transaction of like you make something and you sell it to someone is actually kind of like the purest, least fraught way to fund a lot of things. And the internet seems to finally be coming full circle where people don't think everything should be free and people are willing to pay for stuff.
I'm Kate Brown, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. The Los Angeles-based trend forecaster and writer Shawn Monahan is well known for his incisive assessments of the zeitgeist. His observations on culture have frequently gone viral. Shawn most famously coined the term vibe shift a few years ago, a phrase that made its way into outlets like the New York Times and The Guardian. In the early 2010s, he co-founded the trend forecasting collective Khole with a group of artists. Though short-lived, Khole had an outsized influence on the cultural sphere, most famously for introducing the notion normcore. Shawn's popular newsletter 8 Ball, which you can find on Substack, is essential reading if you're interested in decoding contemporary aesthetics. Shawn joined me to talk about his own trajectory from art school to trend consulting. We spoke about institutional decay, post-internet art, generational shifts, and why culture feels a bit stuck right now. We also discussed how the 2020s might finally be becoming a decade. Hey, Shawn, how's it going? I'm so thrilled to have you on the show.
I'm good. How are you?
Great. Thank you for getting up very early in LA to talk to me in Berlin. I appreciate it.
It's not that early. I'm just not really a morning person.
I'll try to be as sharp as possible for the evening in Berlin. Let's start into it, though. I thought a good place to start would be talking about your own trajectory. You went to art school. So could you chart this path? How did you get from art school into ultimately trend forecasting and corporate consulting?
A long line there.
Yeah.
But I went to RISD. I studied painting. RISD has a very kind of medium-specific educational model, but painting really is kind of a general fine arts hack within that structure. So even when I was in art school, I was doing, I guess, what I would call like kind of conceptual writing projects. And RISD was where I met my collaborators that I started Khole with. Khole really began kind of as, it was an indie publishing project, but it was also kind of, I don't know, performance art maybe. I think the way a lot of interesting creative projects start, we might not have even known very specifically exactly what we were trying to do. What we did think was really interesting was a lot of the kind of corporate literature that circulated around these creative industries. And so, when we were graduating into the Great Recession, we saw, as is normally the case, a lot of people with creative ambitions going into the creative service industries as day jobs. And that was kind of really where we discovered these trend forecasting documents and set out to make our own. I'm giving a very abridged version here, but basically we did that for a while. Khole initially was very much, I think, a project that lived in the art world, even if its audience expanded into people working in the creative services industries, whether that's advertising or fashion or even more corporate styles of consulting. And, it was really normcore going viral that kind of created this opportunity to take something that had been a very like fun and interesting creative project that we were kind of subsidizing and releasing through different art world venues. Because, we launched our reports at places like the Serpentine Gallery or MoMA PS1 to actually having opportunities to work with really large corporations. I suppose I just like flowed where gravity led me.
Were you like disenchanted with the art world? Did you feel like you kind of left it at some point specifically?
I don't really think I'm part of the art world anymore. I mean, I have a lot of friends in the art world and I still go to events and I pay attention to what's going on in a sort of like personal way. And I do also consider that to be part of my broader research practice, being engaged with people who make things. Because I still do really believe that there is something of an avant-garde. There are people who are doing kind of difficult and complicated things. Those things obviously don't always have larger market ramifications. But a lot of the job of a trend forecaster is seeing things and making bets on which things you think have kind of the potential to scale to be part of a bigger cultural moment. Khole is always such a funny thing because, and I say like it's hard to chart the trajectory because I think we used to use the term strategic ambiguity. At the beginning, there was something kind of fun about the degree to which people couldn't really peg down what it was. And I think we had such a strong voice and aesthetic identity that it really projected being something much larger than it was. Because what it was, of course, like a collaboration between 5 people. But then at the same time, our art practice was releasing free PDFs, which is very hard to monetize in an art system that's really about trading objects. fundamentally. When you really drill down into most of what supports the art world's ecosystem, it is trading in physical objects. And then simultaneously, you end up in this grass is always greener situation, I guess, right? Where on the one hand, there's a lot of freedom in the art world. How you monetize different creative practices is a problem, and it's kind of perennially kind of an intra-industry conversation, right? How do we make space for things that aren't traditional object making practices like painting or sculpture or even video? How do you incorporate these more conceptual or performative kind of practices? But then on the other hand, yes, it's easier in some ways to, I think, make money in a more straightforwardly business way. But each side kind of has its own trade-offs, I guess. I think ultimately, retrospectively, the reason why Khole had kind of a strong short run was that we straddled those two worlds. We didn't really make any concessions to one side or the other. Ultimately, that kind of made it a time-sensitive project, I guess, right? Because you do kind of have to just give in to the demands of what your job ends up being,
I think what's so interesting about Khole for me was I remember I was working in a commercial art gallery at the time, and it was really one of the first instances of alternative circulation streams happening where something was circulating that was about the art world that was ultimately cultural criticism. I mean, I know it's also a performance project. You guys are really early adopters of what ultimately became one of the main ways that we are digesting culture now is off the mainstream platforms. I also think you were really early as being a crossover platform where you weren't exactly speaking to the art world anymore. And now that is house rules.
Well, one, we were influenced by people like Seth Price.
The artist, yeah.
I think he kind of introduced the idea that you could make a piece of art that was a PDF. And this was certainly something that while I was at RISD, other people thought was kind of a funny, cheeky thing to do. It was the 2000s. I think people were really interested in what they could do with their MacBooks, which sounds kind of silly, but it was a very powerful tool to make things. And the internet offered all these new ways to kind of disseminate information and also to talk to different kinds of audiences. To me, when I think back to the art world in the early 2010s, that was kind of a big theme. And even into the 2000s, I went to RISD and I remember watching a Family Finds Entertainment by Ryan Trecarton, which he distributed on YouTube. I think these things seem almost kind of quaint now to think back on how that was a kind of revolutionary art distribution strategy. There was a real focus on that because all these things were actually very new and people really didn't know quite how they worked or what should be done with them. But I think a lot of artists correctly identified that it was an opportunity to speak to a larger audience and maybe not a traditional institutional art world audience, which I think again is kind of this perennial desire of artists to speak to as big a group of people as possible to have some kind of impact.
Yeah. So do you think then in a way, in that time in the early 2010s, the seed of disenchantment with institutions was sort of planted?
Yes. I have to think back, but I remember being in art school in the 2000s. I went to RISD from 05 to 09. And the kind of dominant discussion was if the art world had become too professionalized. This was kind of the classic MFA versus NYC debate that you saw in literature too, because there were these new educational programs that kind of purported to professionalize being an artist. This is kind of right before the economy falls apart. That was seen as kind of the track that a serious creative person should go on. You get your BFA, and then you get an MFA from a small list of schools that blue chip galleries look at. And then that's how you kind of start your career. On the one hand, there was a little bit of grousing about how this professionalization kind of took a bit of the magic away of being an artist. There was a lot of worry that artists were becoming lawyers, which I feel no one is worried that artists are becoming lawyers anymore. And then two, but really, I think this was something that people complained about, that the art world was being overly professionalized and that this was kind of constraining it in certain ways and maybe leading creativity away from the more interesting applications towards things that were just market oriented, right? And so that was the other side of it too, was that the art market was doing well, the economy was booming, and then, everything fell apart. And so I think there was annoyance at educational institutions, which had convinced people to take on lots and lots of debt and maybe even more debt to kind of avoid the bad economy. And then also that this kind of whole pyramid scheme, which a lot of higher education, it's a bit like a pyramid scheme, had kind of already closed off too, because the point was basically that, and I feel our professors would say this to us, was that, well, you go to RISD and then you get a Columbia MFA and maybe your work has a market application. But if not, you just get a job teaching. I don't think there's that many jobs teaching anymore for all the people that got MFAs during that period. Bit of false advertising, a weird bit of a bait and switch where simultaneously, maybe art's just going to be a normal white collar career now. Maybe markets are rational enough that, if you're smart, you can have like kind of a stable stream of employment doing this now. And then, the Great Recession happened. I think people lost a lot of faith in institutions afterwards.
For sure. This is really like a classical tragedy of the millennial pipeline.
It wasn't just artists. It was a lot of different professions. People with different life aspirations, I think, felt similar disappointments about how the institutions actually panned out versus what they were promised when they were, teenagers.
The rise of K-hole really parallels the rise of post-internet art. And I was thinking about this in terms of the 2016 Berlin Biennial, which was curated by Dis Magazine. And I know that there's like some disagreement about this, but it was like the peak of this movement in some ways. And a lot of the works in that biennial, I think that they express this exact kind of cynicism around professionalism and the professionalized artist. There was like a lot of works that spoke to that.
Yeah.
So maybe you could speak about K-hole in parallel with post-internet art, because you just wrote a great post not so long ago looking back at this era.
I think of K-hole as being kind of part of the broader post-internet art umbrella. One, because I think there was a general interest in pop culture that was, in the early 2010s again, a bit transgressive. I feel like I remember when we started K-hole, a lot of people thought it was annoying that we were being kind of like conspicuously consumerist. And also that we were like speaking to money and professionalism in a way that like was present, like I was just saying, but also kind of like you didn't really talk about it very much. And I think
that's very boomer.
Yeah, but I think a lot of post-internet art was really interested in pop culture as a vector to like reach the masses. So some of that is definitely cynicism, where I think like a pop cultural interest can always come off as cynical in some ways. I mean, I think maybe that's just the legacy of Andy Warhol even. But yeah, I mean, I think, this whole idea that there were like new and interesting things to be made on all these new and interesting platforms was very much kind of the subtext of all of that. It's not like K-hole was like really structured to address social media per se. It was pretty social media agnostic as a project. But obviously, the thing that it's best remembered for, Normcore, is entirely a creature of social media virality. And I do think like, Normcore and most post-internet projects kind of sought to navigate that, because no one really knew what they were doing. That's the other thing that's always kind of forgotten now when you look back, is that it was actually genuinely experimental because the platforms were constantly changing. There were constantly new platforms, and the ways that they worked were constantly changing. And it was all kind of opaque because it was black box algorithms. You didn't necessarily quite know how anything was working. So you were just kind of like beta testing things to see what worked and trying to kind of reverse engineer some kind of strategy about how to interact with all these new systems from that.
I'm glad you brought up Normcore. We'd be remiss to skip it. I feel like it's the term that you can never get away from. You keep being invited to speak about it again and again, but it is really important because it still circulates a lot in the public imagination. You recently also said it's still here and it just got more expensive. So could you maybe expand on that?
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is, in the original Normcore document we wrote, we have a line about how people's fashion stagnates or looks the same as the last time they were really getting laid. And we use this to explain why middle-aged men are all wearing cargo shorts. And so there's something similar happening with millennials as well. Normcore was, in many ways, an era-defining kind of, I don't want to call it a movement. When people call it a movement, it makes it sound like something it's not. Aesthetic. Let's call it an aesthetic.
Yeah, there wasn't like a philosophy behind it, really.
Like, when people call it a movement, it sounds like there's a protest or something attached to it, which I don't think anyone was thinking about it in that way at all. I think it's just like very much how people dressed in the mid-2010s. And the thing is that like, as people grow up, they tend to not change how they dress that much. They become more conservative in different styles.
Which mirrors their politics sometimes too.
Exactly. And then this also, as people grow up, they hopefully are making more money as they become adults, and they tend to buy more expensive things. So I think Normcore has had this kind of weird way in which it's kind of grown in parallel to millennials. And even though I don't want to be a total generational traitor and say that millennials are doing well, but, to a certain extent, the whole like millennials are totally broke meme is psychic scarring from the Great Recession. Not entirely true. There are plenty of affluent millennials buying, really expensive mom jeans. I think that was always my joke about the $900 Bottega mom jeans or something like that.
No, that's a really important point. And also, millennials are set to inherit a huge amount of wealth in the so-called great wealth transfer that's upon
Yeah.
us by 2045.
Yeah. When I think about millennials and money, I think a lot of it is just that everything's so weird. That sounds very general. Just kind of like the straightforward way that you would deal with money and career got a bit scrambled for us, which doesn't necessarily mean people are doing poorly, but maybe that their lives look different than they thought they would have,
Yeah.
because the kind of middle class American or upper middle class American life that a lot of people's parents had just doesn't seem as easily accessible. Or even when people reach it, it doesn't really look the same. It's 30 years later, yeah.
It's just like a misaligned expectations or something like that. While we're on this like generational note, I wanted to ask you about Gen Z, because I'm sure as a trend forecaster at a corporate level, this must be what everyone's talking about and wants to know about and wants to tap into. It's like the next generation that's going to be spending a bunch of money. And I know like in the art industry, I sense there's a great amount of anxiety about who these under 28-year-olds are and what they're going to be doing. They have a very different relationship to money, from my understanding. They don't want to repeat what millennials did.
Yes.
They're scarred by us too.
Well, on the one hand, generations are always kind of bullshit in the sense that like you're talking in really broad aggregates. So you really are kind of speaking to different historical moments and, the stories we associate with them. I don't know, like you look back and you watch a show like Gilmore Girls or something, and you kind of really see the sense of like academic competition and a real like kind of romantic belief in college. And a sense that like if you just work hard, everything's going to come together for you and everyone's going to have like a really peaceful, pleasant, affluent life.
A merit-based society.
Yeah, for Americans, yeah. And for Gen Z, I think, they just didn't grow up with these same expectations. It's just, to me, it's just like self-evident that it would be very different to have your childhood informed by like the very peaceful, prosperous 90s versus the kind of chaotic early 2010s when the economy's falling apart and the country's been at war since you were in kindergarten. It just leaves a different mark. But yeah, no, I mean, all the younger people I know are much more money focused in terms of like their professional trajectory than I would say millennials were. I think a lot of millennials still bought into this like idea that if you're good at doing something, the money would just come, or, the things kind of just will work themselves out. Whereas I think Gen Z has just a lot more anxiety. But a lot of young people I know are doing very well.
Well, because they are money focused, as you said. Like, what would you say about their consumer habits? Like, how are they different?
I would say that the internet has just fundamentally changed their relationship to consumerism, and that they see everything as much more closely related to their identities than, say, millennials did. I think there's just a sense that like buying things is much more of like a personal branding exercise than it was even amongst millennials.
Right. So turning back to, that piece you wrote about the dysbiennial, you argued in that piece something that I thought was really interesting. You said, I'm paraphrasing, like that there's no new avant-garde, that we're sort of stuck and that the culture can't move forward right now. And in particular, you write that there can be no avant-garde in a quote unquote climate of fear. Could you expand on that gridlock? And also, do you see some exit ramps from that?
Well, one, I think the gridlock has to do with social media. I just think human beings fundamentally aren't supposed to have this much attention from this many strangers on them constantly. As I was just saying about Gen Z having kind of a more personal branding inflected relationship to consumerism, that also kind of comes from this general sense that you're being surveilled or judged or upvoted or liked. I mean, I think these things sound almost corny to bring up now because they've become so deeply normal, but I think they're like deeply abnormal for just human beings. And I do think, and a lot of this is my perspective on hearing people talking privately, that people have just a general kind of paranoia in the art world.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
About what their peers are thinking about them. It's very meta. I think it's easy to just point at politics, right? Like, I think that's what everyone would think I'm talking about explicitly when I say that. But that's only kind of one piece of it,
Yeah.
I think people have similar anxieties about like who they talk to at parties and where they go out to eat. And I think these things have always been latent in any kind of cultural scene that does really rely on interpersonal relationships, right? There's always a bit of like a popularity contest, or you're always managing how you're perceived in these kinds of spheres. That's not new. What's new is just that all these things have been supercharged by the internet. And I think that to have interesting creative ideas, you have to kind of be a bit more reckless, right? I think the upside is that it does seem like social media is just really collapsing right now. I really feel like AI is just going to kill it.
Yeah, but just like bury it. I mean, you were talking about how we're in the slop era.
Yeah, no, it's just turning it into television. The whole like idea of social media originally was that like it's like a hive mind and everyone's participating. But you really have like a power law effect on most of these platforms already where like maybe 1% of the people makes the content and then the other 9% is liking, sharing, commenting on the content. And then the other 90% is just consuming it passively. Weirdly, there's like a good outcome from that trajectory kind of being super powered by AI and that like if it just turns back into TV, it kind of neutralizes some of this like public performance of the self that everyone got very pulled into in the 2010s.
That dovetails with this phenomenon that we're seeing where people are becoming again really interested in these IRL intimate experiences, which is what the art world was based on for many, many years, you know, like intimate dinner parties, intimate interactions, word of mouth. Yeah. That's kind of how the art world has always worked. And I don't think that that works very well with the idea that like an artist should have like 20,000 followers and that like establishes their value or something, right? So what would you say about that change?
I mean, I think this has always been the secret superpower of the art world amongst kind of all culture industries. It really does demand some in-person participation, even at the level of like, you know, there's a lot of parties and dinners and things like that. I think some people look at that and they see it as very frivolous and stupid, but in a lot of ways, that's the core of like any kind of creative community is actually, this is kind of like the weird flip side of what I'm saying before about, you know, this kind of ambient social paranoia, but that's kind of the way that community cuts, right? Like I'm from a small town. There's a lot of parallels between a small town and something like the art world. And that there's like a limited number of people and everyone kind of knows who everyone else is and is keeping tabs on them. But then at the same time, there's like support and creativity that comes out of those relationships.
I was talking to a collector at a dinner recently, and he worked in like mergers and acquisitions in the food industry, which says a lot about the power of these kinds of dinners, because he was saying, I love coming to these art dinners because there's no other place that you'll sit beside a corporate lawyer, an artist who like can't even pay their rent and like bring all of these different people together. I mean, whether or not that actually brings about meaningful change or something is another topic, but people rub up against each other in a different way, right?
Yeah, there's something similar in tech sometimes, but in tech, the parties just aren't nearly as fun. To me, it's a big problem. When people are trying to do things, make things, and people really care about ideas, you do have to have this kind of social substrate to power them because people are, you know, working off of one another and in response to one another. I think that is kind of like why I'm never too bearish on the art world. I feel like it goes through different cycles, obviously. Just talking about like our education was like in the 2000s is so different than what it is now. And that's only 20 years ago. But the fact that it always is relatively small scale, which is actually good. And it does reduce down to interpersonal relationships.
Right.
These things I think are just like stronger bonds. I think that's also why you see like artists having longer careers than like internet personalities, you know?
So you mentioned tech. You also had written that like crypto wanted to be the next avant-garde, but that didn't quite pan out for them. And I think, you know, in general, the tech world has had an interesting time kind of like linking up with the art world. It's been awkward. It's worked in some instances and not in others. I'm curious what you think about the crypto scene in general, because I know that you've attended some of their events as an observer, participant. I don't know. Spy.
I have. I don't want to be too mean. I don't love it. You know, it leans too hard into kind of the obvious direction of where technological advancement is taking us. You know, it's like a little bit too much like sports betting on your phone,
which seems to be a big thing right now.
I know, and it's really bad. We are going to have a real reckoning with it in 10 years' time. But the thing is, a lot of the people who are going to have problems with sports betting are also going to have big financial problems from betting on like weird meme coin, rug pull bullshit. Money is like too central to it. It's like for all the criticisms that the art world is money obsessed and the art market is, you know, maybe totally indifferent to art historical value versus monetary value or something like that. It's miles away worse in any sort of crypto environment. I mean, like, let's look at like the Bored Apes Yacht Club. That was like really the breakout star of quote unquote crypto art. the thing is, no one cares unless the monetary value is there. And I think that's a real distinction from the way the art world works. I don't actually think that people don't care about things if they don't have like big price tags attached to them necessarily. I mean, obviously, if you're a collector, if you're an investor, something like that, these things really, really matter. But, when people are arguing about like if one work is more important than another or something like that, no one really like is going to the auction values to prove that out. So I think that that's kind of like the Achilles heel of a lot of crypto, is that it kind of stakes its importance on its speculative monetary value. But, most of it, what's the figure? 95, 99% of all the NFTs sold in like the kind of like 2021, 2022 boom all went to zero. So I'm not sure that those things are going to be cared for, taken, considered, treated with like any kind of respect, 10 years in the future.
I'm sure we're going to get some dissenting comments about this. I think that also there's been a lack of mainstream canonization around, like lack of maybe criticism, cultural critics that are really like building a discourse around this as well.
Yeah, people did try. I feel like people tried to build, magazines that could kind of treat this new form of digital art seriously. I don't know if it really panned out though. I mean, but that's a whole like kind of kettle of fish, because criticism in and of itself has been in a crisis for at least the last 20 years, Yeah,
maybe we should talk about that a little bit. A lot of meaningful cultural criticism has moved off of a lot of these mainstream platforms and off a lot of mainstream media, so to speak, onto places like Substack. I'm curious, a lot of people will know Substack that are listening, but like, could you explain a bit about how viable this has become as a platform?
If you have an angle and an audience, you can make a living off of Substack, which is, to me at least, pretty genuinely new. I think it works better than Patreon. This is kind of like a typical thing where, the platform that's earliest to a model, and this model being just like micropayments, basically. People subscribe, they pay you a monthly fee to look at your content. It's very straightforward. It's very transactional, which I actually think is healthy in a lot of ways. Certainly healthier than trying to like sell your visibility to advertisers, which was like kind of the influencer model of the 2010s. I think there were a lot more problems actually with that than I make something, I sell it to you. It's very like printing press or something. I've got this printing press and I print out my flyers and then I go on the corner and I sell them. But you're doing it digitally. But yeah, no, I mean, I don't know. We have Diva Corp in Los Angeles. A lot of people talk about Diva Corp. It's like an anonymous art critic. It's kind of interesting that that's a bogeyman.
Operating on Instagram.
But I think they also have a Substack. Am I wrong?
Oh, do they? Okay.
I'm pretty sure they have a Substack too. Maybe I'm wrong. Regardless, a lot of people have kind of weird funnels. On the one hand, I think things like Substack are good because they provide an alternative way to do criticism. But it's also a little tricky, maybe even more so than the Substack angle on Diva Corp, is that, it's interesting to me that they're operating anonymously, which I think says something about the decline of criticism, and that, like, do people feel like they can be really brutally honest today as someone who's a critic or working for a mainstream publication, or even operating online independently under their own name? Or do they feel like they don't have kind of the institutional weight to be honest, right?
Yeah.
Because once upon a time, an art critic could be brutal. They could be honest because they worked for...
They were employed.
They worked for the New York Times or something. So they could be really nasty sometimes if they felt it was necessary, but, they weren't going to get disinvited from the dinners. Writing generally has become like this. This is not like an art world specific thing, in that the compensation rates go down. But if you write and you address culture, part of your compensation ends up being, people flying you places, people taking you to dinner, people putting you up in hotels, getting put on like kind of a press junket. There's certainly some like conflict of interest that happens there, right? That's a bit different than like the kind of old school journalistic approach. When people will interview me sometimes, I'm pretty freewheeling about giving out free subscriptions to my Substack. Like if someone wants to interview me, I'll be like, oh yeah, let me comp you one. And they won't take it. They're like, oh, well, we can't take gifts. Which is, again, like that's because they're employed by traditional media outlets that have, had a very long time to think about what the ethics and parameters of these things should be. And any kind of cultural criticism, I think, struggles because tends not to be part of these like huge traditional publications. It is implicit that like part of the compensation is being invited to participate in these things.
I mean, you've written for The Guardian and publications like that. Just to push back a bit on Substack, which I'm a great fan of, there is a, this sort of traditional model where there's, multiple editors looking through something, fact checking, this kind of thing. Can you speak about that a bit? Like, that is a bit of a worrying thing. Do you miss Gatekeepers?
I like Gatekeepers. I think Gatekeepers are good. I think for me, for the style that I work in, because I'm being very speculative, oftentimes it's easier to self-publish because people aren't always interested in the things I'm interested in the moment I'm interested in them. And so I have kind of a parasitic relationship maybe with the press, in that I write about something early, and then they write about it later when maybe it's more legible to a mass audience. So we both benefit from that. But at the same time, I feel like if I was working in a more journalistic capacity where the facts mattered more. Well, I'm very much writing about my opinions. Mm-hmm. I'm sure I've misstated facts before, absolutely, because I don't have an editor. But it's a little bit less perilous, right, than if you're like a political reporter or something, whether or not the facts are like a little fuzzy here and there, because they're not really there to give their opinion. They're supposed to be accurately describing something. But I agree.
Fair enough. A good example of that is the term the vibe shift, which you termed back in 2021, which I feel like is still something that, you're being invited to write about or is being cited in these like legacy media publications.
Again, I'm surprised at the duration of that. I thought it would have gone away by now.
And you said you lived through 4 of them, which I identify with most of them, like the hipster indie music moment from 2003 to 2009, post-internet techno revival from 10 to 16, hypebeast woke from 16 to 20, which is the Trump presidency. And what is happening after 2021?
Yeah. Well, that one is fuzzy because, when I wrote it, I knew something new was happening, but I wasn't quite sure what. But I think, at the end of that piece, I had a couple of predictions that I think most came true. One, I predicted that like a lot of young people are more interested in publishing and literary endeavors than they are the art world.
Oh, yeah.
Which to me seems resoundingly true. There's just tons and tons of independent publishing projects, lots of young writers. I think part of this is like the same reason that Khole existed, which was that we were young and broken. Writing is a very, very cheap medium. You can do it on your computer. So that really opens things up to a lot of people who maybe couldn't afford to have a studio and buy nice oil paint and stretch canvases and all these other things in like these like kind of white hot real estate markets that we find ourselves in places like LA and New York and London and Paris and whatever. So that I think came true. I said there was going to be a rock revival. I think that's definitely come true, especially aesthetically. If you look at all the mullets that young men have today. I said that I thought like woke performative Instagram politics were in decline. That might have been a bit hidden in there in my graphic, but that certainly came to pass. I said that there was going to be, I called it naughty Audie's nostalgia. That was like a funny term from the 2000s, but that kind of got christened indie sleaze. It was a pretty good list of predictions that I put in there.
For sure.
I would say they mostly came true.
So 2021 to now, like, are we still in an era, would you say? Or is there a new one? Or are we in the cusp of a new one?
I think we are. I think there's this funny way in which I'm constantly trying to think about myself, where I'm positioned, the people I'm surrounded by, which I know are not representative of like any mass market. I know a lot of people who are musicians and DJs and fashion designers and artists and writers. And that's not like what the consumer market is, right? So I think we're still in that moment in a mass culture way. I have inklings that something new is coming around the corner, but I don't know what yet.
And so boom boom, which is a term you coined most recently.
Yeah.
Which I think is a really interesting one because it speaks to me to like the recessionary pressures and sort of this like living large as a last gasp in like a polycrisis or a perma polycrisis, whatever like the term is by now. Do you think that this is going to stick around? And could you define that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, so this started with my questioning of why there were so many young men I knew who were wearing suits all of a sudden.
Without jobs or?
Yeah, exactly. Why are these young, broke creatives in Los Angeles wearing suits when they go out on the weekends? Because it's kind of odd. I think there's a severe status anxiety right now in the United States. I think we don't know who is steering the ship, so to speak. We don't really have a clear elite. Like this was kind of where this thinking started, was that like people are projecting status because they feel like the status hierarchy is in flux and they want to kind of fake it till they make it to the top of whatever comes next. And so taking on these kind of traditional status markers is kind of like wearing a suit of armor against all the uncertainty that we kind of face right now. We talked a little bit about tech. I think part of the reason that we have this whole mass social status anxiety is that like tech is clearly the rising class in terms of wealth and power, but I don't know that they're very good at politics or culture. It's a bit of a West Coast problem too, because the West Coast is traditionally not as good at politics and power as the East Coast is. You know, I think the whole Elon Musk crash out was like a really great example of how you might be really good at making rocket ships, but totally unable to navigate politics in Washington, D.C. And so that leaves us at kind of a weird juncture, right? Because it seems like tech should take over the world, but they seem to be struggling despite their disproportionate financial resources.
So there's like a lot of fear hiding under these power suits, so to speak. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of, whether it's come to pass yet or not, there's a lot of job anxiety too about AI taking people's jobs. So
absolutely. It's going to be very interesting to see the American upper middle class get gutted by this next round of automation, because they've really been the ones that have kind of done very well over the last 30 years. If there's one kind of group of people who benefited from the political economic paradigm after the Cold War, it's the American upper middle class. People are very wealthy. People are very affluent. A lot of that is like white collar tech jobs, et cetera. It seems like AI is really gunning for all those people. And like, I don't know what happens if you pull the plug on that. I don't know what happens to like urban real estate economies and things like that. I also think that the American upper middle classes, they're pretty conscientious. They're pretty smart. They're pretty well organized. So what will the response be to half of all the lawyers' jobs in America getting nuked? I feel like those people aren't just going to like shrug their shoulders.
Speaking from the cultural sphere particularly, is there like a silver lining to culture being kind of pushed back towards the margins, having to necessarily become a little bit scrappy again if, you know, everyone's largely disenfranchised in this next tech boom?
I don't think it's the worst thing. There's like a saying in Silicon Valley that small groups of people moving fast do big things. And I think you can apply that to cultural scenes too. New ideas tend to come out of like relatively small groups of people that know each other relatively well. You can have kind of like a big art historical perspective on something like post-internet art, but it was a pretty small number of people in a couple of places, Berlin, downtown New York, who all knew each other and were interested in the same things and were in conversation with each other, both in kind of like the pretentious art speak way, but also just in the like literal sense of being acquainted and being friends. There's an inherent scrappiness to things like that. And historically, avant-gardes, they're not mass movements, at least not at the beginning.
There will be a new avant-garde at some point. It's just not here yet. The second coming.
I'm not totally black-pilled at all. I think we've just gone through a really weird moment where kind of the internet just tore down all of our cultural institutions. And I think this way about Substack even, because the people who've done best on it are, say, like people like Barry Weiss with the Free Press, which is just a magazine. You know, it's just a magazine. It's a digital magazine, but it's just a magazine. So we're kind of like going through this really long arc of, oh, maybe there's going to be all these new models for how we fund things. But the basic kind of consumer transaction, which I think the art world is really averse to thinking about things this way, but it is true. The basic transaction of like, you make something and you sell it to someone is actually kind of like the purest, least fraught way to fund a lot of things. And the internet seems to finally be coming full circle where people don't think everything should be free and people are willing to pay for stuff that they find online, whether that be music or writing or film or video or TV. It's just kind of rebuilding the same kind of institutions we had before. You know, I live in Los Angeles, so a lot of people talk about film and television, the pernicious effect that Silicon Valley money has had on the quality of American film and television seems self-evident to me. Hopefully, the people with good taste can have a stronger voice in what gets made and how it gets made. Right now, it definitely seems like the people who are good at engineering the platforms maybe have too much of a say, or the people who are giving the startup capital to platforms have too much say in the kind of cultural output they have. But it does feel like, you know, Netflix is just TV now.
And Instagram has also become like kind of just a broadcast media, which is boring. So people will go elsewhere.
Yeah, like TikTok is just MTV for Gen Z kind of thing. I think these are kind of healthier ways to think about it, because they all start out very weird, but they seem to kind of settle back into a pattern of like, there are people who make things, there are people who consume things. And, you know, yes, the formatting of it has changed, but fundamentally you're trying to build a model where the people who make things get paid to make them. And the early era of the internet in the 2010s, like I was saying, this kind of like influencer model. I mean, I think kind of K-Hole got caught up in that too, maybe to some extent. we didn't have like a plot to monetize the project. We didn't even think that far ahead. But there was this like general sense, again, like millennials just thought, well, if you do something well, it will just work, right? Which is very naive. So we didn't have a plan to monetize it. And then all of a sudden you find yourself in this situation where like, oh, well, if the things you're writing are popular with large corporations, maybe you can consult for them. But then all of a sudden the thing that you care about has become like a marketing project for doing corporate consulting, which is maybe not your primary interest in the first place. I think we found ourselves in a lot of these kind of conundrums just across all kind of cultural mediums in the 2000s because everyone was like kind of pushing people to make stuff for free. And then they're like, oh, well, we'll figure out how to, monetize it later, which oftentimes just looked like, oh, well, maybe you're a content creator, but like actually what you need to do is treat yourself like a media platform and you're like a vector for advertising now, which is not what these people wanted to be doing in the first place. So I think kind of just the straightforward transactions seem to be returning to culture are good.
Yeah, definitely. I think that things are in a little bit of a scramble right now, but they are going to start making sense again soon. And they'll make sense to different people in different ways, but that's also absolutely okay. Like if we get out of like a sort of monoculture, that's not the worst thing either. So
yeah, I mean, I think Substack gets like a lot of flack. Obviously the content's not all great. As it's grown, probably the quality of the content's gone down because there's a lot of people on the platform that are fooling around, which is great. But also I think when people like kind of look at it in aggregate, it's not the same kind of professional product that you get from the New York Times, and it kind of can't really be.
And maybe it doesn't need to be.
My friend Mike Pepe wrote a book against platforms. We kind of argue about this a little bit. He likes to shit talk Substack on the platform a lot. I'm very ambivalent about it though. Like I know it's not an institution, but I think if it's getting writers paid, it's good.
For sure.
That didn't seem like that was going to come back.
That really didn't seem like it was going to come back. I'm happy about that.
In the late 2010s, the idea that writers could make a living off of writing again seemed very far-fetched and was very dire. So, I think you take the wins where you have them. And then hopefully people, like I said, with Barry Weiss, she is just building a publication. You can take the same kind of payment infrastructure and the same new comfort that people have paying for digital content to maybe build something bigger, more long-lasting, something that looks a bit more like a New York Times, maybe not quite that prestigious, but something that has that same institutional functionality where you have editors and you have different people doing different pieces of the labor, not one person doing everything by themselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks so much, Shawn. It's been a real pleasure. We managed to cover a lot, so I really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili with contributions from myself, Ben Davis, Carolyn Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.